Captain Sarah Martinez had been flying commercial aircraft for 12 years, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened on Flight 847 that cold November morning. The Boeing 777 was carrying 200 passengers from Denver to Miami when disaster struck at 35,000 feet. It started with a simple warning light. Sarah was reviewing weather reports for their descent into Miami when the engine failure alarm pierced through the cockpit's usual hum. Her co-pilot, James Chen, immediately reached for the emergency checklist as Sarah's hands moved instinctively to the controls. "Engine 2 is showing critical failure," James announced, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Sarah could feel the aircraft shudder as the massive engine on the right wing began to lose power. What made this situation even more dangerous was the violent thunderstorm they were flying through, with lightning flashing outside the cockpit windows. The passengers in the cabin had no idea what was happening at first. Mary Williams, a grandmother from Colorado, was reading a book to her 5-year-old grandson when she noticed the plane suddenly felt different. The smooth flight had turned bumpy, and she could hear the engines changing their sound. In the cockpit, Sarah was quickly realizing they had multiple problems. Not only was the engine failing, but the storm was getting worse, and they were losing altitude faster than normal. The nearest airport was Jacksonville, Florida, still 200 miles away. But with only one working engine and severe weather conditions, making it there seemed impossible. "We need to declare an emergency," Sarah told James as she struggled to keep the aircraft level. The plane was becoming harder to control with each passing minute. She grabbed the radio and contacted air traffic control with the words every pilot hopes never to say. "Mayday, Mayday, this is United Flight 847. We have an engine failure and are requesting immediate assistance." The air traffic controller's voice crackled back through their headsets. "Flight 847, we copy your emergency. Jacksonville Airport is your nearest option, but we're showing severe weather in that area. Can you maintain altitude?" Sarah looked at her instruments and felt her heart sink. They were losing altitude at 800 feet per minute, and the storm was pushing them off course. "Negative on maintaining altitude. We're descending through 28,000 feet and it's getting worse." Back in the passenger cabin, people were starting to panic. The flight attendants, led by Senior Attendant Rebecca Torres, were trying to keep everyone calm, but the turbulence was getting violent. Passengers' drinks were spilling, and the overhead compartments were rattling loudly. Dr. Michael Foster, a heart surgeon traveling to a medical conference, noticed how the plane was shaking differently than normal turbulence. Having flown hundreds of times, he sensed something was seriously wrong. He watched the flight attendants' faces and could see the worry they were trying to hide. Sarah's mind was racing through her options. Jacksonville was too far and the weather was too severe. She needed to find somewhere else to land, and fast. That's when she remembered something from her training years ago. There was a small military airfield about 80 miles northeast of their current position. Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. "James, pull up the charts for Eglin Air Force Base," she ordered. Her co-pilot quickly found the information on their navigation system. "It's got a 12,000-foot runway, which is long enough for us," James reported. "But Sarah, it's a military base. They don't handle commercial traffic." "Today they do," Sarah said firmly as she adjusted their heading toward the base. She radioed air traffic control again. "We're unable to reach Jacksonville. Requesting clearance to Eglin Air Force Base for emergency landing." There was a long pause before the controller responded. "Flight 847, stand by while we contact Eglin. This is highly unusual." Meanwhile, at Eglin Air Force Base, Colonel David Park was in the control tower when the emergency call came through. In his 25 years of military service, he had handled many emergency situations, but never a commercial airliner with 200 civilians on board. "Sir, we have a United Airlines flight requesting emergency landing," the young airman reported. "Engine failure, severe weather, 200 passengers on board." Colonel Park didn't hesitate. "Clear all runways immediately. Get our emergency crews ready and contact the nearest hospital. How far out are they? Approximately 15 minutes, sir, but the pilot is reporting difficulty maintaining control. As Sarah fought to control the aircraft, she could see the storm clouds getting darker around them. Lightning was striking closer to the plane, and she knew they were running out of time. The passengers could feel every shake and bump as the plane descended through the turbulent air. Young Tommy Williams, Mary's grandson, looked up at his grandmother with wide, frightened eyes. "Grandma, are we going to be okay?" Mary hugged him tighter, even though she wasn't sure herself. "The pilot knows what she's doing, sweetheart. Everything will be fine." But in the cockpit, Sarah wasn't feeling confident at all. The controls were becoming less responsive, and warning lights were appearing on multiple systems. The storm was pushing them around like a toy, and she could feel the aircraft wanting to roll to the right where the failed engine was. "We're losing hydraulic pressure," James announced, adding another serious problem to their list. Without hydraulic pressure, controlling the aircraft would become nearly impossible. Sarah's years of training kicked in. She had practiced emergency scenarios like this hundreds of times in flight simulators, but this was real life with real people depending on her. She could hear the fear in the passengers' voices behind the cockpit door. "Eglin Tower, this is Flight 847, she radioed. "We have multiple system failures now. We need that runway cleared and ready. We're coming in whether you're ready or not." Colonel Park's voice came back strong and reassuring. "Flight 847, Eglin Tower. Runway 12 is cleared and waiting for you. We have emergency crews standing by. You're cleared for emergency approach." As they broke through the storm clouds, Sarah could finally see the lights of Eglin Air Force Base in the distance, but they were still too high and coming in too fast. The aircraft was barely responding to her controls, and she knew this was going to be the most challenging landing of her career. "James, deploy landing gear and prepare for emergency landing procedures," she commanded. The sound of the landing gear extending was music to their ears. But Sarah knew the hardest part was still ahead. The passengers could see the lights of the runway getting closer through the windows. Some were praying, others were holding hands with strangers, and many were thinking about their families. Flight attendant Rebecca Torres was making sure everyone had their seatbelts tight and was prepared for impact. Sarah lined up the aircraft with the runway, fighting against the crosswinds from the storm. The plane was shaking violently, and she could feel it wanting to drop out of the sky. With only one engine providing power and limited hydraulic control, she had to use every skill she had learned in 12 years of flying. "We're coming in hot," James warned, watching their speed indicators. They were approaching much faster than normal, but there was nothing they could do about it. Sarah's hands gripped the controls tighter as the runway rushed up toward them. This was it, the moment that would determine whether 200 people would go home to their families that night. The aircraft touched down on Eglin Air Force Base's runway with tremendous force. Sarah pulled back on the controls as hard as she could, trying to keep the plane straight as it bounced and skidded along the wet pavement. The sound was deafening. Metal grinding against concrete, engines roaring, and the screech of brakes working overtime. Inside the passenger cabin, people were thrown forward against their seatbelts as the plane decelerated rapidly. Oxygen masks had dropped during the descent, and the cabin was filled with the sounds of crying children and frightened adults. But they were on the ground, and they were alive. Sarah finally brought the aircraft to a stop about 1,000 feet from the end of the runway. For a moment, there was complete silence in the cockpit except for the sound of their own breathing. She had done it. All 200 passengers and crew members were safe. "Nice job, Captain," James said quietly, his hands still shaking from the experience. But there was no time to celebrate. Sarah could smell smoke coming from somewhere on the aircraft, and she knew they needed to evacuate immediately. She grabbed the intercom microphone and spoke to the passengers with a calm voice that hid her own exhaustion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have successfully landed at Eglin Air Force Base. For your safety, we will be conducting an immediate evacuation of the aircraft. Please follow the flight attendant's instructions and exit quickly but calmly. Outside, Colonel Park watched from the control tower as emergency vehicles surrounded the plane. Fire trucks, ambulances, and military personnel were positioning themselves around the aircraft. He had coordinated the entire emergency response, but seeing the massive commercial airliner sitting on his military runway was still surreal. The evacuation slides deployed from multiple exits, and passengers began sliding down to safety. Mary Williams helped her grandson Tommy down the slide, and they were immediately met by Air Force medics who checked them for injuries. Most passengers were shaken but unharmed. Dr. Michael Foster, the heart surgeon, immediately offered his medical assistance to help with any injured passengers. He worked alongside the military medics to make sure everyone received proper care. As the last passengers were evacuated, Sarah and James finally left the cockpit. They walked through the empty cabin, checking for anyone who might have been left behind. The aircraft that had been their home in the sky for the past terrifying hour was now just a damaged machine. But it had served its purpose. It had brought everyone home safely. Colonel Park met Sarah at the bottom of the evacuation slide. "Captain Martinez, I'm Colonel Park. That was outstanding flying. You saved a lot of lives today." Sarah was exhausted, but she managed a tired smile. "Thank you, Colonel. I couldn't have done it without your team's help. Having this runway available made all the difference." As the immediate emergency wound down, Colonel Park began making arrangements for the 200 unexpected guests at his military base. The passengers needed food, shelter, and transportation, but the nearest commercial airport was hours away. The storm was still raging, making any immediate travel impossible. "We'll set up temporary accommodations in our visitor quarters and mess hall," Colonel Park told Sarah. "Your passengers will be safe here until we can arrange transportation." What happened next surprised everyone. Word of the emergency landing had spread quickly through the base, and Air Force personnel began volunteering their own time to help the stranded passengers. Airmen brought pillows and blankets from their own barracks, cooks prepared hot meals, and communications specialists helped passengers call their families. Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who had been on duty that evening, organized a group of volunteers to help with the children who were on the flight. She and several other female airmen turned one of the common rooms into a makeshift play area, complete with games and activities to help the kids cope with the scary experience they had just survived. Tommy Williams, who had been so frightened during the flight, was now laughing and playing with other children under the care of these kind military personnel. His grandmother, Mary, was amazed at how quickly the Air Force had mobilized to help complete strangers. "I can't believe how wonderful everyone has been," Mary told Sergeant Rodriguez. "You've turned what could have been a terrible night into something almost magical." Meanwhile, Sarah was in Colonel Park's office, going through the necessary paperwork and reports. As she filled out the incident forms, she learned more about the base and its mission. Eglin was home to several fighter squadrons, including F-22 Raptors, some of the most advanced fighter jets in the world. "You know," Colonel Park said as they worked, "your landing tonight is going to be talked about for years. Not many civilian pilots could have pulled off what you did, especially in those conditions." Sarah was grateful for his words, but she was still processing everything that had happened. The weight of responsibility she had carried, knowing that 200 lives depended on her decisions, was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Dr. Foster approached them with a report on the passenger's medical status. "Everyone checks out fine," he announced. "A few bumps and bruises from the rough landing, but nothing serious. You did an incredible job, Captain." As the night wore on, something wonderful began to happen. The passengers, who had started as strangers on a flight, were bonding with each other and with their military hosts. Stories were being shared, friendships were forming, and what had begun as a disaster was turning into an unforgettable experience of human kindness. Rebecca Torres, the senior flight attendant, was particularly impressed with how the Air Force personnel had stepped up. "I've been flying for 15 years, she told Colonel Park, and I've never seen anything like this. Your people have gone above and beyond." But the most surprising part of the evening was yet to come. Around midnight, as most of the passengers were settling in for the night, Colonel Park received an unusual phone call in his office. "Colonel Park, this is General Stevens at Air Combat Command," the voice said. "I've been briefed on tonight's emergency landing. The F-22 pilots at your base have made a special request regarding Captain Martinez." Sarah looked up from her paperwork, curious about what could be so important at this late hour. "What kind of request, General?" Colonel Park asked. "Well, it seems unusual, but they want to do something tomorrow morning before the passengers leave. Something about honoring Captain Martinez for her flying skills. They've never made a request like this for a civilian pilot before." Sarah was puzzled. She had barely interacted with any fighter pilots since landing. How could they even know about her situation beyond the basic facts of the emergency landing? Colonel Park looked at Sarah with a smile. "Captain Martinez, it appears you've made quite an impression. Would you be willing to participate in a brief ceremony tomorrow morning? The F-22 pilots specifically requested to meet you." Sarah was tired and still emotionally drained from the flight, but she was curious about why elite fighter pilots would want to meet a commercial airline captain. "I suppose that would be fine, Colonel. But I don't understand why they would be interested in meeting me." "Neither do I," Colonel Park admitted, "but these pilots don't make requests like this lightly. There must be something special they want to tell you." As Sarah tried to get some rest in the base's visitor quarters, she wondered what the morning would bring. She had successfully landed a damaged aircraft and saved 200 lives, but somehow she felt like her story was far from over. In another part of the base, Captain Jake Viper Johnson and Major Amy Phoenix Davis, both F-22 pilots, were having a conversation that would change everything for Sarah. They had been monitoring the emergency radio traffic during the landing, and what they had heard had left them both amazed and deeply respectful. "Did you catch how she handled that approach?" Captain Johnson asked his fellow pilot. "With one engine in a storm, minimal hydraulics, and she still brought it down safely." Major Davis nodded seriously. "Jake, I've been flying fighters for 8 years, and I don't know if I could have done what she did tonight. That wasn't just good flying. That was extraordinary flying." They had spent the evening learning more about Captain Martinez's background and the details of the emergency landing. What they discovered had convinced them that tomorrow morning needed to be very special indeed. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds as Sarah Martinez woke up in the visitor quarters at Eglin Air Force Base. She had barely slept, replaying the previous night's events in her mind over and over. The weight of what she had accomplished was just beginning to sink in. After a quick breakfast with some of the passengers, who were all expressing their gratitude for her skill and bravery, Sarah was approached by Colonel Park. He looked different this morning, more formal, almost ceremonial. "Captain Martinez, the F-22 pilots are ready to meet with you now," he said. "If you'll follow me to the flight line." Sarah was curious but agreed. As they walked toward the aircraft hangars, she noticed that many of the passengers had gathered along the way, as if they were expecting something special to happen. Tommy Williams and his grandmother Mary waved at her from the crowd. When they reached the flight line, Sarah was amazed by what she saw. 4 F-22 Raptor fighter jets were lined up perfectly on the tarmac, their sleek gray bodies gleaming in the morning sunlight. These were some of the most advanced military aircraft in the world, worth over $150 million each. Standing in front of the jets were 4 pilots in full flight gear. As Sarah approached, they came to attention in a precise military formation. The lead pilot, Captain Jake Johnson, stepped forward and saluted her. "Captain Martinez, I'm Captain Johnson, call sign Viper. On behalf of the 58th Fighter Squadron, we want to thank you for what you did last night." Sarah was confused and a little embarrassed by the formal treatment. Thank you, Captain Johnson, but I was just doing my job. Major Amy Davis, the second pilot, stepped forward. Ma'am, with respect, what you did last night was far beyond just doing your job. We monitored your radio communications during the emergency, and we want you to know that your flying skills impressed all of us. Sarah began to understand that these elite military pilots had been listening to her struggle to land the damaged airliner. She felt honored, but still didn't understand why they were treating this as such a special occasion. Captain Johnson continued, Captain Martinez, we've been flying military aircraft for years, and we consider ourselves pretty good pilots. But after listening to how you handled that emergency last night, managing a single-engine approach in severe weather conditions with minimal flight controls, we realized we were in the presence of someone truly exceptional. Colonel Park stepped forward with a large folder in his hands. Sarah, what these pilots are trying to tell you is that they've done something that's never been done before in the history of this base. Sarah looked around at the gathered crowd. Not only were the passengers there, but it seemed like half the base personnel had come out to watch whatever was about to happen. She was starting to feel nervous. Major Davis smiled warmly. Captain Martinez, last night after your landing, we contacted our squadron commander and requested permission to do something special. We wanted to honor your flying skills in the way that fighter pilots honor each other. Captain Johnson nodded. Ma'am, we'd like to invite you to fly with us this morning. You'll be in the back seat of my F-22 for a formation flight over the Gulf of Mexico. It's our way of saying that you're one of us, a true pilot's pilot. Sarah was stunned. She had heard of honorary flights for distinguished visitors, but this was completely unexpected. I don't know what to say. Are you sure about this? Absolutely certain, Major Davis replied. But there's more. Colonel Park opened the folder he had been carrying and pulled out an official-looking document. Sarah, the Air Force has also prepared something else for you. This is an official commendation for your heroic actions in saving 200 lives. It will become part of your permanent record and recognizes you as an honorary member of the 58th Fighter Squadron. The crowd of passengers began to applaud, but they had no idea what was coming next. Captain Johnson reached up to his helmet and flipped a switch on his radio system. Suddenly, his voice was broadcast clearly through speakers so everyone could hear. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, we have a special tradition in the fighter pilot community. When someone demonstrates exceptional skill and courage in the air, we give them a call sign, a nickname that honors their achievement. Sarah's heart began racing as she realized what was happening. Major Davis took over the announcement. Captain Sarah Martinez, after careful consideration by all the pilots of the 58th Fighter Squadron, we hereby grant you the call sign, Guardian, in recognition of your protection of 200 souls under the most challenging conditions. The applause from the crowd was thunderous. Passengers were cheering, Air Force personnel were clapping, and Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. In the military aviation community, receiving a call sign from fighter pilots was one of the highest honors possible. But Captain Johnson wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a radio headset similar to what fighter pilots use. Captain Guardian Martinez, he said formally, there's one more thing. When you fly with us today, you'll be using our squadron frequency. But first, we want to establish communication with you the way fighter pilots communicate with each other. He handed her the headset, and she put it on with trembling hands. Captain Johnson then did something that gave her chills. Guardian, this is Viper. How do you copy? For the first time in her career, Sarah Martinez was being addressed by her new call sign by elite fighter pilots who considered her their equal. She keyed the microphone with a shaking voice. Viper, this is Guardian. I copy loud and clear. The F-22 pilots broke into broad grins. Major Davis stepped forward. Guardian, welcome to the Brotherhood of Aviators. Your courage last night proved that the sky belongs to those brave enough to master it. As Sarah was fitted with a flight suit and helmet for her honorary flight, the passengers watched in amazement. Mary Williams was crying tears of joy as she held her grandson, Tommy. "Grandma," Tommy asked, "why is everyone so happy?" Mary hugged him tightly. "Because, sweetheart, the lady who saved us last night is being honored by some of the best pilots in the world. She's a real hero." Dr. Michael Foster approached Sarah before she climbed into the F-22. "Captain Martinez, or should I say Guardian, I want you to know that what you did last night and what's happening here this morning will be something I'll tell my children and grandchildren about for the rest of my life." Rebecca Torres, the senior flight attendant, was equally emotional. "Sarah, in all my years of flying, I've never seen anything like this. You didn't just save our lives. You've brought honor to all of us in commercial aviation." As Sarah climbed into the back seat of the F-22, Captain Johnson turned around from the front seat. "Guardian, are you ready to see what it's like to fly like a fighter pilot?" "I'm ready, Viper," Sarah replied, still amazed that she was using these call signs with actual military pilots. The 4 F-22s took off in perfect formation, climbing rapidly into the clear morning sky above the Gulf of Mexico. For 30 minutes, Sarah experienced flying like she had never imagined: high-speed turns, vertical climbs, and precision formation flying that demonstrated the incredible skill of her fellow pilots. As they flew over the sparkling waters of the Gulf, Captain Johnson's voice came through her headset. "Guardian, what you did last night with that damaged airliner was every bit as challenging as anything we do up here. Maybe more so, because you had 200 lives depending on every decision you made." When they landed back at Eglin, the entire base seemed to have turned out to welcome them back. As Sarah climbed out of the F-22, she was met by applause not just from the passengers she had saved, but from hundreds of Air Force personnel who had heard about the morning's ceremony. Colonel Park presented her with a framed certificate and a squadron patch that she would treasure forever. But the most meaningful moment came when all 4 F-22 pilots lined up and saluted her one final time. "Guardian," Captain Johnson said, "you'll always be welcome here. You're family now." As the buses arrived to take the passengers to their final destinations, they each made a point of thanking Sarah personally. But it was young Tommy Williams who summed up what everyone was feeling. "Miss Guardian," he said, using her new call sign, "when I grow up, I want to be brave like you." Sarah knelt down to his level and smiled. "Tommy, you already are brave. We all are when we need to be." As she watched the buses pull away from Eglin Air Force Base, Sarah Martinez, now known as Guardian to some of the most elite pilots in the world, reflected on the incredible 24 hours she had just experienced. She had started as a commercial airline captain dealing with a routine flight and had ended up as an honorary fighter pilot with a call sign earned through courage under fire. The damaged Boeing 777 was still sitting on the runway where she had landed it, but it no longer represented disaster. Instead, it stood as a symbol of what's possible when training, skill, and determination come together in the face of impossible odds. Years later, whenever Sarah flew over Eglin Air Force Base on her commercial routes, she would switch her radio to the F-22 squadron frequency and hear a familiar voice. "Guardian, this is Viper. Welcome back to friendly skies." And she would always respond, "Viper, this is Guardian. Good to be back home." The story of Flight 847's emergency landing became legendary in both commercial and military aviation circles. But for Sarah Martinez, it would always be remembered as the night she discovered that being a pilot isn't just about flying aircraft. It's about protecting the precious cargo of human lives that trust you to bring them safely home. The 200 passengers she saved that stormy November night would never forget Captain Guardian Martinez, the woman who earned her wings twice. once as a commercial pilot and once as an honorary fighter pilot, who proved that courage knows no boundaries when lives are on the line.